All right, this might be a bit of a quick podcast here because we're talking about something very simple. How to know if you're playing bad or running bad, like Phil Hellmuth always does, apparently, right? So
It's always running bad.
he's
It's
always he's
insane.
running back for his whole life, right? So let me start by saying a couple things, and then Scott, I'll pass it on over to you. Um, there are some people that always feel like they're running bad. One is Mr. Helmuth right there. They always, always, always feel like they're running bad. Their whole lives, 10, 15 years, the whole career. I'm just running bad. That's that. And then there's another group of players that always, always thinks that they're just not good enough. They're not playing well. What's the syndrome called? I feel like you've labeled this before with something like those people that like they have excellent results or whatever, and they still don't think they're playing good or whatever. What's that called?
What's that called?
Yeah, I feel like you said a name for that one time. Maybe I'm remembering wrong, but
Describe it again.
just like people that are like that are like good. They're like good poker players, but then they always just feel
Yeah.
like they're just not good. You know what I mean? Like a good player that just thinks he's not good or believes that he's just not good at all, even though his trivia
Oh, a
results
good
are
player
like
that thinks he's not good.
yeah, yeah.
Um, it's that imposter syndrome,
The
isn't it?
imposter syndrome, yeah, imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
So there's like one end of the spectrum is like I'm the best and I just always run bad. That's all the way here, right? I'm the best, I always run bad.
Yes.
On this side, you got the guy that is just like I'm just playing bad, even though his Chippy V results are fine, right? So how do you know? How can you step back from yourself and objectively know, okay, this is not just run bad. I got to do something about this, or you know, how can you tell the difference? Like it's a very confusing topic, right? Like let's say you're a poker
It
player.
is. It's difficult.
How do you know? How do you know? That's the question, Scott. You have any thoughts on that to begin with? How would you? What advice
Yeah.
would you give someone? Or he's like, I'm not sure. Like, am I playing bad? Am I running bad? Like, where do I look? How do I figure this out? Um,
Yeah. Well, the most basic thing would be your so just speaking in PT4 terms, would be your EV line and your green line. So, like running bad in the truest sense would be running under EV. You know that your EV line looks good and your winnings is not great. Beyond that, if you're having a tough time in EV, then obviously that's
but what
more
kind
the
of what
focus
kind
of
of
the
sample?
session.
Like, let's talk about like samples, right? Like, let's say like somebody's EV
Mm,
line is like let's say 1,000 games, and he's playing reg speeds and like he's you know let's just say maybe his graph is up like 13 chips for that guy
mm,
right there. Let's say he played 1,000 games, he's at 13 chips and reg speeds like $100 games. Let's just call it that. How like,
yeah.
and he's like, I'm not sure. Am I running bad or am I playing bad? How do I know? I'm looking at this 1,000 game sample. Hmm.
Hmm.
How do they figure that out? You thinking?
Okay, so there's a good few ways to sort of figure this out, either on your own or ideally with someone else. First thing I'll say is a fresh pair of eyes on your game is always super useful because
Yes.
if you're too close to something, often it's difficult to make objective decisions about it, and there's going to be emotional attachment to your results. Because you're emotionally attached to your results, you're ultimately going to be biased. You're going to either think one way or another. Like Jack said, depending on the type of person you are,
Mm-hmm.
either you're going to blame variance too much or you're going to blame your own performance too much. And so you're going to misrepresent or misinterpret results the way that you want to see them. So getting a fresh pair of eyes is really good. If you've got access to a coach, that's the best thing. Um, the next thing would be in PT4 or whatever program you use, would be to check your blue and your red lines. So if your blue line is dying, but your red line is soaring, there's a decent chance that you're not doing particularly well at showdowns. There's a good chance you're running bad. But if your blue line is soaring and your red line is dying, then there's a very strong possibility that you're not playing aggressively enough, that you're running fine, but that you're just missing spots. Beyond that, you want to look into your database. So your statistics really ought to give you an indicator of how you're performing. So, for example, if you take spins, like Jack said, if you take spins, you can, using any program like Lucid or GTO Wizard, you can go through and find the statistics um, for each individual spot, right? You can either do it manually by going through and just noting down like the c-bet frequencies, or you can use reports and you can note down the c-bet frequencies, for example. You can note the pro frequencies. You can note quite a lot of positions. You look at the frequencies that you would expect a GTO, and then you compare them to your own in your database. And that's the most illuminating thing, I'd say, whenever you're running bad. To be honest, you can run really good and have really good results, and then have a coach look over your numbers and see, actually, you're probably underperforming, and that you're likely to run bad in the future because at the moment you're over-realizing. So number one for me would be, well, if I put it in sort of three things. One would be have someone else look over your hands in your database. Number two would be look at your red and your blue line. And number three would be to compare your frequencies to GTO, I would say, in that order.
Yeah, I would agree with all that. And there's something I want to add too, like in terms of, let's say, for example, you're looking at a 1,000 game sample, yeah, Scott? Like, let's just say.
Yeah.
I think anybody who's watching this, you can self-audit and figure out very quickly, very, very quickly, if you're running bad or you're just one of those people that, like, you know, thinks you're playing bad or running bad or whatever. Let's say you're looking at a 1,000 game sample of, let's just say rec speeds, just to keep, because we were already talking about that. You can, you know, equate this to ultras for 3,000 or 4,000 games and a low chip EV, whatever it equates to. If you're, for example, looking at a 1,000 game graph and you see a high chip EV and you're just like, and you're just thinking like, I'm just playing really good. You know what I mean? If you think I'm just playing very good, and then you look at your entire sample, let's just say, right? And your entire sample is, let's say, like 14 chip EV. Like, let's say you have a sample of like 15,000 games, right? Let's say you have a sample of like 15,000 games, yeah? And your 15,000 game sample is 14 chips. And you're taking that 1,000 game sample and you're like, I'm playing really good. I can promise you, you're probably one of those guys that's probably not playing very good, and you need to look at your game. Okay? And
that's recency bias right there.
Yeah, and then the other way around. Let's say you have a 15,000 game sample and your chip EV is like 40, right, in that sample. And you're looking at the last 1,000 games and you're at 12 chips. And you think to yourself, I'm playing really bad. You're probably just running bad, right? So, like, it's those people. Like, it depends. How do you look at your short samples? Do you give yourself credit when you look at a short sample and the chip EV is going high? If you do give yourself credit on that short sample and you're not really focusing too much on your big sample, you might be playing bad. So you gotta you know, maybe do some work on your game. But if it's the other way around, let's say you take responsibility and you think you're playing really bad over short samples, you're probably doing the exact opposite. So I know that may sound a little confusing, but you know, you can think about it off the top of your head. Like, anybody that shows you a short sample and says, you know what, I'm playing really good, and then you ask them for the full graph and it doesn't look so good, you know, you can probably assume that person is possibly diluting themselves with that shorter sample, right? Like, you can possibly just assume that, like, okay, you know, let's look at the bigger picture here, right? So that's the biggest. I think that's the biggest audit, because there are people, you know, that will look. Let's say, for example, they have like long-term, you know, pretty poor results. Let's just say in rec speeds, they're playing rec speeds at like less than 10 chips, which in rec speeds is pretty bad, right? And then they're just always like, I'm running bad. The problem with that mindset, that's a more detrimental mindset. The problem with that mindset is, if you always just assume you're running bad, it's always safer to assume you're playing bad, by the way. But that's detrimental as well. We'll delve into each. Let's say you always assume that you're running bad. What's the problem with that, right? Like, you're not going to really study because you're like, oh, I'm just running bad. I'm already good enough. I'm just running bad. Running bad, and you're not going to study, right? And then the other end of the spectrum, and then I'll let you take over in a second. But the other end of the spectrum, you can cover that in a second. The running bad thing I just said. So if you always assume I'm running bad, obviously you're not assuming that you're playing bad. So you're like, oh, I don't need to work on my game. I'll just keep playing, and eventually I'll just run good. You know, that's very detrimental. And then the other extreme is quite detrimental as well. If you always think you're playing bad, let's say, for example, you have that chip EV over that 15,000 games, like we talked about, 40 chips, and in your last 1,000 games, you're playing at like 12 or whatever, something lower. And you're like, oh, I must be playing bad, and now you start making drastic changes to your game when you shouldn't have. You were probably just running bad, right? Like you're like, oh, all of a sudden now I'm gonna start, check raise jamming turns and like over folding to all these different kind of players. Like you start making over adjustments, and that can go bad as well. So both ends of the stick, are pretty bad. Just like always, like the extremes are always pretty bad. In the middle, you gotta be self-aware. If your results are not doing good for a prolonged period of time, you really gotta look at yourself in the mirror and be like, you know what, man, I gotta do something about this. Something's not right. Something's not right. I gotta change my game. You can't just blame it on run bad. And also, if your overall results are pretty good, how can you you can't just think you're playing bad over a short sample. You just can't. So you got to kind of like get into that middle ground somehow. But yeah, Scott, I know you had some things to say about.
No, you actually you covered pretty much what I was going to say. And then you've got the opposite, but you pretty much drilled it.